Hey everyone, welcome to another episode of Darshan Talks. I am your host, Darshan Kulkarni. As some of you may remember, I'm an attorney and a pharmacist and advise companies with FDA regulated products. So if you work in or have an interest in an FDA regulated company or its products, this is the podcast for you. Today's podcast is about trust. But unlike the idea of trust as people usually think of it in terms of, well, what are the strategic ways of doing it? We're going to talk about operational trust and we're going to talk about technological trust. So if you are in the life sciences, if you are in technology, if you are looking at the connection between trust and pharma, and how do you operationalize that at a technological level, you should care about things like blockchain. You should care about things like distributed ledger technologies, Hedera Hashgraph, and we have the perfect person to talk to us about that. So please leave a comment, subscribe. If you disagree with our guest, feel free to tell him because I can assure you he will tell you why he's right. And today's guest, let me tell you a little bit about him. He was the chief software architect at the CDC and was also the entrepreneur in residence there. He is currently the co-chair of the Supply Chain Clinical Trials Technology Implementation in Industry Connections for IEEE. I out of all of those words, I only understand the word supply chain and I understand the word IEEE. But to me, that just reads impressively. He's also an expert advisor to the Pharma Ledger Board. He is also currently CEO of Acor, and Acor has a few different projects that are interesting. The core part of Acor, I believe, is using blockchain to create healthcare solutions that provide the computational trust you deserve. And for that, they have a couple of current projects. They've got a data stamping API that can stamp and validate digital objects with geolocation, date, time, and a 2D barcode. They're also tracking the COVID-19. And he currently just came into the news, and I believe it's starting to go viral right now, about the fact that he's going to be working with Forecast to talk about fake news. So, everyone, I'd like you to welcome our guest for today, Jim Nasr. Hey, Jim, thanks for coming on.
Hey, Darshan, how are you? And thank you for that
good to have you on.
overly loquacious description of my background. And as always, you embellished things that are probably less impressive than the way you presented them. But either way, I appreciate it.
Well, you are an impressive man. I try not to always do justice to that. So let's start with the basics.
Always justice, but I appreciate it.
So let me ask you a really basic question, Jim. People talk about blockchain and they talk about distributed ledger technologies, and I'm going to start calling them DLTs from now on. Yeah. DLTs and blockchain for being, and I say and again, same thing, for being trustless. You and I have had some conversations previously about what does that mean, and is that even the right terminology? So if you are a pharma company and you go, you know what, I want a trustless environment, is DLT the right solution for them?
Yeah. So look, I don't personally like the word trustless, and I typically don't use it when I explain what we do or the blockchain world, mainly because I think it's somewhat of an oxymoron of a word that you can get really hung up on the nomenclature. So I prefer not to use it. I think the intention really here, with that word and description is that you can use technology, right, to provide a means for trust amongst people that don't either trust each other or don't even know each other, right? Mm-hmm. And it's, you're not relying on an entity, right, like a bank, as example, or a clearinghouse to provide that trust as an arbitrator of trust. You're, essentially this trust is coming from the underlying infrastructure and technology amongst a group of peers, right? Again, not a hub and spoke model, but a group of peers. So you, me, and 7 other people, all about the same height and weight, right? Same intelligence, all kind of doing the same type of work. So that's what it's about. Now, going back to your more, I think, kind of pertinent response, is can blockchain DLT, and I would also stick with DLT because I think blockchain technically speaking, has a specific meaning that's largely to do with this idea of chains of rather blocks of data that are chained together in a sequential way, and DLT is more expansive than that, right? And so let's stick with DLT. So can DLT provide a mechanism for computational trust for software and cryptography, and infrastructure to provide you trust amongst a group of peers? The answer is yes. Is it just that simple? The answer is no, right? Because it's infrastructure, right? And it's not. You still need to build proper application. You still need to consider other things. In our world of healthcare, pharma, of course, there's a lot of regulatory compliance. So for you to be HIPAA compliant is not as simple as just saying you're using, Hedera hash graph as a DLT to record, some transactions, on an immutable ledger. That doesn't, one is not the same, right? And you can't just say, you're gonna throw out the concept of overall like security, right? Security of your network, your software applications, user access, all of this, just because you happen to have a DLT at play, right? So, again, unfortunately, all of these things, when it comes to technology, the answer is more nuanced than just like a binary thing. You kind of notice it, and thank you for mentioning the work we're doing with Forecast News and this fake news and censorship in journalism and things like this we're working on. So where I'm going with this is that the answer is often not binary. It's often not, yes or no or 0 or 1. It's kind of a gradient, and it's like a Bayesian. It's you're dealing with probabilities, and that's what we're doing as example with Forecast News. Is we're working with them to essentially data stamp authenticated, or rather kind of verified content, but that's not all the content in the world. And then we're also working on this idea of a trust score that essentially triangulates individual, if you like, trust scores or verified content scores from different authorities, and then comes up through an algorithm with a number that says, look, based on our algorithm, we think that this particular content, this particular tweet or fact or whatever is with 80% confidence is accurate. So all to say, it's kind of a Bayesian world that we're in, and so a lot of the answers are more nuanced than just yes or no, right? We kind of have to delve into a little bit. So in a long-winded way, I was trying to answer you in that yes, it can help, but it's not the only answer. It's part of the solution.
I feel like you answered it like a politician. I have no idea what the answer was.
That was my intention.
Let me ask you.
I have a book coming out, so all these things is really a ruse to get you guys to buy the book that's coming out.
And soon. What's the book going to be called, Jim?
It's going to be called Practical Blockchain.
There you go. And where can someone get Practical Blockchain?
Yeah, exactly.
No, where can someone buy it?
It's going to be Amazon, any bookstore. Yeah, we're actively working on it, so. Maybe in a few months we'll talk about the specifics. Yeah.
Okay, sounds good. So let me ask you a few different questions that came out from what you just said, right? So the first one, and I couldn't tell if you were joking or you weren't, and you talked about this idea of 7 of us who are about the same height and weight when you said that. And I assume computationally that just means 7 computers that have similar processing and abilities. Does that mean
software, not so much similar processing, but similar, like really the same software. So you could have different you could have like a server farm, you could have a GPU, you could have, my laptop, all of them running the same software. As example, again, I think it's important to give real examples. So I'm working with, with this, what's called a long phi, and I may have mentioned at some point to you privately, kind of like basically a low power, long range Wi-Fi, kind of like hotspots for the world. Right. So that's, and the hotspot that I run in my home or, my office, that is a node, just like any other hotspot around the world that's doing the same thing. And we provide this Wi-Fi. Now, my singular hotspot, even though it's running the same software, would have a lot less power than a server farm running the same software, right? And if you look at the Bitcoin space as example, could you could I as an individual with my laptop be a node on the Bitcoin network and mine Bitcoin? Yes, in theory. what are the chances that I would successfully do it, amount of time and money spent to do so, versus a giant server farm that's somewhere in Ireland or Iceland, with 20,000 or 100,000 connected GPUs. I think the answer clearly is that server farm has a much better chance of solving those puzzles and more processing power, even though we're running the same software.
So it's not about. So what I'm hearing you say is that the more powerful systems have an advantage over the less powerful systems.
Well, in some regards, right? Not when it comes to like more or less trustworthy. It's really a question of more or less processing power, which then in turn most likely allows you to do more mining. Which is really the mining is essentially how computationally you prove a transaction has happened. So as opposed to 7 of us getting on a phone call and saying, did Jim really send $10 to Darshan? And all of us saying, yes, I looked at the ledger. That the mining process essentially get to what's called consensus. And consensus is when basically, 2 or more nodes say, yes, this transaction happened. And the rest of the nodes take a copy of that transaction and put it on their individual ledgers. Because remember, there is no like Amazon doing it for us, right? It's all 7 of us essentially are running, if you like, the same ledger. 2 of us or more can come to consensus and say, yes, this transaction happened, and the rest of us copy that transaction. That process of getting to consensus computationally is what's called mining, right? That's really the mining process. And of course, again, not to get too nuanced, and I know your audience probably doesn't want to get into this level of detail. Everything I'm kind of talking about here is in the guise of a public blockchain, a public network where there's transparency and mining and things like this. If you have a private network, if you're running like like as example, Fabric, a Hyperledger Fabric, and you have like 5 invited nodes within your consortia, this mining process is not necessary. It's not going to happen, right? So this is what we're talking about, a public ledger. But most of my, as you've heard me kind of maybe rant about this before, my thinking is if you're going to use blockchain, and you don't have to, but if you're going to use it, the biggest value in terms of, at least in a regulated space, in anything with the word public in it, is when you're using a public ledger for finality of certain kind of transactions that require transparency, require reporting, require, this idea of trust, right? Because if it's just the 4 or 5 of us doing this and then report, like at some point, like at the end of the month, that hey, this thing happened, but there's no way to interrogate it. I mean, that's just like a portal, right? You're not getting the benefit of the transparency and finality and things that we're talking about here. Oh, I cannot hear you anymore. I think you're muted.
Yeah, I was trying to avoid outside noise. So I heard you on that, and I have several questions that come out of that. The specific question that comes out of that for me is certain nodes will have more power because they can broadcast farther and they can process faster. Mm-hmm. If that's true, and let's say I wanted to force a answer, theoretically, and I'm speaking purely at a theoretical level, could I insert a virus onto the network that prospectively looks at the major nodes and basically goes, I'm going to affect those transactions, therefore causing fake transactions? And is there a way? Go ahead.
Nothing is impossible, but really what we're talking about here is a different metaphor, right? It's not the metaphor is not about the processing power. It's metaphor is about infiltrating the actual software. And this really gets into essentially how you manage your code and how you basically do your deployment of code, how you do your pull requests, how you potentially fork software. One of the reasons, by the way, that there's some contention about certain kind of open source blockchain protocols is that they've been forked, which means that, as example, the Bitcoin protocol is fully available, in open source space. So I could go if I wanted to and create Jim's Bitcoin, right? And that's happened. Yeah. Now the question is, if now all of a sudden I have 10 or 100 or 10,000 kind of nodes on my network, can we trust Jim and his team to have actually done the work properly, to have not forked the code, where if because there's a saying that says many eyes make bugs shallow. So typically for big open source projects like Bitcoin, like literally tens of thousands of developers have looked at the code. It's been interrogated by scientists and cryptographers and computational computer experts and things like this. However, if I fork my code, if I fork Bitcoin and create my own code, is there going to be the same level of rigor on that forking? And then later on is things like governance, right? And how do you really know that if I created a forked version of this kind of open source code, that the governance for it will be at the same level of integrity and the same level of management as the original. Anyway, all to say, is it possible to have a virus? Yes, but really it's at the software level is where that's going to happen, right? And
right.
That's, again, there's certainly some other situations and examples, but this is a common scenario we're talking about.
Okay, good to know. So another question you sort of talk about is this idea of consensus, and that's really where the trust comes from. Could you talk a little bit about how you gain consensus appropriately? Like, what are the different methods out there, and how are they different?
Yeah. Honestly, and not trying to be facetious or pass off this particular question, this is like a giant chapter, in the work that we're doing, because it's not that straightforward.
Okay.
I would say let's just think about simply. Yeah. Very simply speaking, let's use the analog kind of model. Let's say, it's you and 5 buddies or 4 buddies, at a round table playing poker, right?
Yeah.
So you and the other 4, you all are in the same place. You can basically in real time, in a very short time, come to consensus on, if a deal, or rather the cards that have been dealt are the winning cards. You can see it. You can agree, you can talk. It's, oh yes. And if there's some kind of, shadiness going on, you can probably detect it. Okay.
Right.
So the idea is, all right, how do we take this kind of concept that's relatively easy to understand in a small group and make it essentially done by computers that are not like managed by one giant computer, right? That manage just independently, just like the 5 of us playing poker. And basically have the ability to scale it infinitum. So you go from 5 to 50 to 500 to 5 million, and this is really where this kind of idea of a consensus comes in, which is to say that there's a methodology, and the methodology really is largely mathematical methodology, right? So as example, Hedera uses this methodology called asynchronous Byzantine fault tolerance. That's been around for 30 plus years as a mathematical theory, right? Okay. So it just turned out that it really wasn't practical to do. It couldn't be implemented until about 2015 or 16, when Dr. Lehman Bird at Hedera essentially discovered the way to implement it so that it could actually be practical and it could be done in an effective way. So that's really where the consensus comes from. That there's some kind of a mathematical proof or way to get mathematical proof, and then some computational implementation of that. Now in the case of Bitcoin, which is the one that I think is most popular and we all hear about, they use this approach called proof of work, right? Where essentially you're solving this mathematical challenge, right? The first node or the first person to solve it gets the reward or the mining. And then eventually, once that proof has been done, after like a 10-minute delay to make sure there's no shenanigans, that transaction is recorded in everybody's ledger. So everybody writes down in their notebook, Jim gave $100 to Darshan.
Right. I'm still waiting.
So that's it. So again, I'm dumbing it down a little bit, but I think it's important to not lose the forest for the trees. Because there's many different consensus algorithms depending on what protocol you use. But the net of it really is how do we kind of have machines running the same software essentially determine something has happened and come to consensus, because that's the most important thing in order for you to then be able to move on to the next step, which is to record a transaction. Okay. Hopefully I didn't confuse you too much with that.
No. That was actually great. So let me ask you how that applies on a practical level. And in that context, you actually referenced it where you talked about the idea of a trust score. And you talked about
Yeah.
how accurate it is. Let's talk about the thing in the news. Let's talk about
Yeah.
what ACOR is actually doing,
Yeah.
where you're talking about fake news. In those situations, how do you even come up with a trust score? I don't need to know the specifics, but how do you, in my book, here, let me tell you as a practical person how I'm trying to struggle with this.
Sure.
In my book, I'm going, we have news that is subjective. It's almost editorialized.
Mm-hmm.
Some of the facts may be accurate. Some of them may be maybe interpretive. How do you judge the trust score in something that is interpretive? And if you do, is fake news the only place that gets applied, or does every lawyer in the world tomorrow start using it and then go, this has a trust score of 5 versus this has a trust score of 10. Therefore, judge, don't even need a jury. Here are the facts that are undisputed.
Yeah. All right. So we have to unravel a lot of things in that, because there's a number of things. And by the way, you probably know I'm a logophile. I enjoy words. So unravel is one of those interesting words for which there is no opposite. So we will not try to ravel it later on. So look, I think first of all, let's be clear. There is a difference between this idea of a trust score and a consensus. Consensus, there's a mathematical proof, right? And it's mathematically proof coming to an agreement, right? This idea of a trust score really is much more Bayesian and much more to do with exactly what you described. Is what if you're talking about a scenario where the definitiveness of something being a fact, one, is not clear or may never be clear, or it's entirely opinion and subjective. So what we do, and this is not to say this is the only way, but certainly is what we're kind of working on, is this idea of, all right, for certain kinds of news, not necessarily for everything, not for like opinions, because like my opinion is my opinion, right? Yours is different. Like,
sure.
For instance, if you say like purple is the best color, okay, well, yellow is the best color to me. That is
right.
We could be looking at like a million different sources and never come to an agreement,
right?
Because that's just a pure subjective opinion. So that's not what we're talking about. We're talking about news tactics. But what we're doing is that we're essentially triangulating multiple, what we are calling authoritative sources for the same kind of content. So as an example, we're looking at the BBC, we're looking at Associated Press, we're looking at CNN, we're looking at New York Times, we're looking at Wall Street Journal. So like 7 or 8 different kind of sources to see if the same information in the same context about the same time frame has appeared. Because again, even though we are doing our data sampling for the work we're doing now, hardly anybody else is doing. So it's not like we can say, all we got to do is look at the data stamp for this content from New York Times, because they're not doing that. In 10 years time, maybe, right? Maybe that is the case. Maybe we don't have, maybe it's much more binary and not so Bayesian. But so that's what we're doing is we're looking at a piece of content. Say the content could be, I don't know, what would be a good example? It could be, and this was actually on our Twitter stream early today. It's interesting. It's all to do with, was the January 6th, coup like exaggerated? Some say, the reporting was unbalanced. Some say it was under, underreported. Some say it was overreported. It was conflated, right? So there's a gamut across this, and people make good arguments about all of this. So our thing is, look, we're not journalists, and it's not realistic at all for any one of us to say, all right, well, we're going to spend a year trying to dissect every piece of fact that could potentially be available about this. So what we're going to say, though, is like, let's look at 7 different, quote, trusted, or at least conventionally trusted news sources about the same topic, about the same context. And then let's compare that to the content that we have, and let's see how much uniformity or variance there is. And they have different weights. So like, for instance, the weight for New York Times may be a higher weight than like Atlanta Journal, as example.
Sure.
Because they have different
like my blog. Right.
Yeah. So, and then our algorithm essentially goes through, and then we do some natural language processing as well to, kind of pry out critical keywords and things like this. But really is to aggregate the individual scores, put it together, come up with like a very simple, like red to green scale. The greener it is, the more likely we have confidence, like in the 90%. The redder it is, the more likely that we have little confidence. Now, it doesn't mean it's not true. It's just our algorithm showing what is trustworthy, what is not. Now, the good news with this approach is that we are essentially kind of milling in the subjectivity that's in the individual sources, right? And coming up with a statistical formula. Again, we ultimately leave it to the reader, right? So if you read this article and it's, kind of like orangish, that's your choice to interpret that as, is this trustworthy or not, right? We're not saying, don't trust it. We're just saying that's how we interpret it. But again, now you could argue, well, hey, can you really prove that somebody didn't write garbage? No, we can't, obviously. What we're saying though is that this is a step forward, right? This gives you some objective metrics and some kind of a unit, a scale that you can look at. And then over the course of time, again, this is kind of like where machine learning comes in too. The more, let's take an example of how Google recognizes cats, like cat photos, right? In 1998, maybe they started with 10,000 cat photos, right? And wrote some machine learning. But in 2018, they had 100 million or maybe like 10 billion or some enormous number of cat photos. So the more evidence you have, the more likely that your algorithm is tuned more and more accurately. And so therefore you can trust it more. So that's kind of the direction we're going. There's for sure, though, I think if you think about the end of this road, or like near to the end of the road, there's definitely needs for some process changes, right? There's need for editorial teams and workflows to be changed a little bit. Imagine if every piece of content, like our podcast here, right? This is your intellectual property. You and I are, we're exchanging, world-changing information. Obviously, imagine Imagine, and by the way, we could do this right with you. Imagine if this podcast, as we go, has real-time data stamping of what we're saying. So then if later on somebody is using your content in a different context or faking it or doing a deep fake on it, you can detect that. And also, frankly, you're doing all this work, and if somebody is profiting from it, you should know about it. And a whole mentality about blockchain is this idea of what I think of as value creation attribution, right? Which is that, look, you're creating value. You're going out of your way in a selfless way to bring interesting information, maybe important information to the masses. So if somebody's profiting from this and you're not, and you don't know about it, but something's wrong about it. And the whole idea of blockchain is to really prove your work, prove that something's happened, and attribute value to who is actually creating the value. Hence the whole mining thing. So not to get philosophical about this, but to me, this is the path that we're going down, right? From the simple data stamping to this idea of a trust score to the idea of interjecting data stamping within the editorial process, so at the source of origin, or when you take a photo and by the way, everything I'm describing to you right now is happening at this moment. None of it is science fiction-y, or I'm not projecting anything. I'm just talking about things that are happening already. So that's kind of it. That's the way we look at it. And I think it's interesting. I think it's a step forward, and I see it being applied not just for fake news, but being used as example. I was just talking to a partner and a colleague, around this declaration of something being organic, right? That there's actually pretty kind of loosey-goosey ways in which people declare something being organic, and it turns out that if you look at the supply chain of what is regarded as being organic, like through the process, through the supply chain, there's about a 50% like surplus of things in the market that declare themselves to be organic. So therefore, where is this coming from? Where is the fake, organic coming from, if you like? So it can be applied across all kinds of things.
So let me ask you several questions that came out of that. The first question to me is the risk of source bias. And what I mean by that is CNN and MSNBC and whoever else is probably getting a lot of their news from AP News, because they release the news and then people read that and rejigger it. Yeah. So depending on how AP News reported it, you're going to have downstream effects that, so for example, Boston Globe or New York Times may say, oh, I'm citing AP News. therefore I can trust this news. Now you're going to give it more weightage because now AP News, Boston Globe, and New York Times all said the same thing. Mm-hmm. On the other hand, let's say this is about the Vietnam War, and a small, tiny place in Vietnam is covering that differently. Mm-hmm. But they're closer to the news itself. How do you weigh that differently?
Yeah, so it's a really, really good point. It's one that we have thought about. So what I would say is, again, the English have this saying, horses for courses, right? So we're not going to have the same number of, or the same even type of sources, depending on context, geography, timing, etc. But we're also monitoring the sources as we go, because as you say, it's very easy to have, kind of positivity bias or false bias, right? And it's not like a constant. We can't just say, we've chosen these things and that's going to be it forever. So part of the process is this feedback loop on the actual authorities. And then how do we either tune them in or out or change the weights for them, right? Where we lower or increase the weights because of exactly the reasons you're talking about. So therefore, again, it's kind of a Bayesian thing. It's not a precise science, at least not right now. I don't want to make any kind of claim that we have figured this out. All to say that we have a pattern that we've kind of figured out, but the pattern has to be pressure tested, right? And for sure that we anticipated the pattern, the sources, the algorithms are going to be, they're going to have to be different, both based on context as well as like the things like geography and kind of things like date or etc.
So we just have a comment saying fake news needs to go. So I'm gonna agree with that statement.
But
here's another.
But I think we all kind of agree with this because, man, we just spent 25 minutes on this call talking about this, and and you and I, we're all, it's not like we're journalists or whatever, but there's so much airtime and just unproductivity around this. Really, honestly, from my perspective, is yes, we all, I think, zealously agree about this has to go, and to me, like things like what's happening with Facebook as example, that's not the way to go. Shutting down news in Australia is not the way to go. I think there's got to be some more nuanced ways of going about this. But I know that, by the way, I know the Australia thing is a payment thing. It's not necessarily quality of news, but even going to Facebook for news in general, it's like almost an oxymoron, right? It's like, that's not where you get your news.
I want to be careful because I have friends who work at Facebook now, but ignoring that part of it, let me ask you a different question that goes to the same point we just made, though.
Yeah.
You told me that the fact that you're working on this process, this algorithm to detect fake news, or at least identify the weightage of the likelihood of fake news. Let's say it was covered extensively. It'll probably get covered in things like the Boston Globe, the New York Times, and that's going to be great. Here's my question, though. I have you on the podcast right now. To me, that carries more weight because I have the actual person doing it. However, your algorithm would actually cover them differently because it's the Boston Globe, it's the New York Times. So how do you appropriately give weightage when you don't know who the source is? And I don't mean the source of the paper. I mean the actual source being conducted.
Again, it's an evolution, right? So we're not going to, what you're describing is, in my mind, again, going back to this unraveling, there's a number of interim steps. Really, ultimately, the way we flip this, right? Because there's, and I've spoken about this a lot. Ultimately, if there is a silver bullet to this, it's a change of culture. But a change of culture, by definition, is neither easy nor quick, nor, frankly, something that people embrace, right? I've come across in my career many times, almost every time. So the change of culture is where you literally go and look at the source content at all of these institutes, and you really verify, like computationally verify and pass on, if you like, that this data stamp. That now you have this data provenance, this chain of changes and provenance all throughout the lifetime of any kind of asset, including like a 15-second time code on a video, right? Even at that level of kind of minute, division. Of course, that's not going to happen anytime soon. That's the kind of work we're doing with Forecast News, but that's just one entity out of like millions, right? So I'm not trying to like project beyond what that is. But so notwithstanding this kind of a culture change that will happen over the course of time, I think the best we can do, not the best, but what we think can be done now is essentially do more and more of this idea of using software that can be interrogated, consensus algorithms, and a public ledger that can be interrogated and openly viewed to triangulate information, right? And then ultimately we're going to leave like, do you trust or do you not trust to the reader, to the user? Because we're not foolish enough to say, look, just because the score is 81%, trust me. We're just saying, based on our algorithm and the things that we're telling you transparently, this is the result we're getting. That's where we look at it right now. Again, that's not the only way. I know of some other folks that look at it some other ways. That's just what we're just, as you know, we're just big believers in can we use the existing technology as is in a I mean, like ready to use now, right?
Yeah.
I don't like so many people pontificate about things that like, well, let's do this in 50 years. But kind of, as you know, in healthcare and pharma, look at Eram's law. Look at what's happened in the last 50 years, right? Medicine is R&D is getting more expensive and takes longer and less productive than it's the exact opposite of Moore's law, right? So to me, like this whole thing of like punting it forward, I just don't like. I think there are things we can do right now. It may not be perfect, but honestly, I feel like it's a step forward. And then the good news is if you do these kind of things, people like you and other folks and our peers, they'll say, hey, you know what, Jim, here's a better idea, or here's a way you can extend it, or here's a way where the community can embrace it, right? It's not about like like it's not some kind of a draconian or a, kind of like a authoritative, mandate, right? We're saying this is an approach, but we can, for instance, this whole blockchain world really is about collaboration. How do we now extend this? How do we make it more practical and usable and all these things that ultimately will, because I think the user doesn't care about the mumbo jumbo, right? The user, like if I'm reading something on Twitter, if there was a little like score thing that said 90%, and over the course of time, I saw that as being reliable, to me, that's good enough.
And I think that to me is the risk, because as you said, it's good enough because I'm now come to depend on it. Now I stop questioning the sources and I just assume that the algorithm's really good. And
that's where your peer group comes in, right? Because again, we make a distinction between the architects and the engineers and the peer group, people like us who are engineering and building this, versus a user, who's looking at some kind of a, like mundane thing on a tweet, right? Now, if they choose to interrogate, we obviously want to make that completely available to them. So you could drill down and you could literally see, hey, look,
but they won't.
Here's how we came up to this. So don't take our word for it per se, but look at how we've come to it. But I think for most people, after a course of maybe like a few examples of this, they're going to quote trust it, because I mean honestly, we trust things right now that have absolutely no kind of bearing, right?
Right.
So I think the peer group is like folks like us, just like we do for some kind of a peer-reviewed article. It's incumbent on us to interrogate. It's incumbent on us to really say, hold on a second, does this make any kind of sense, right?
So I'm going to ask one question that I have as the closing question, but I also have a comment from Dan Safara. So let me ask my question, which was, do you see what I'm hearing you say is that the value in this is in almost getting a consensus from multiple sources to say, you can trust this data, you can't trust this data or this news. Do you see a future, or I should avoid using the term future, you avoid that yourself. Do you see a short-term future where it's a presidential election and they're both making claims, and while they're talking, they can get a score about what they're saying? Or is that too far out because you can't build that consensus fast enough?
No. First of all, thank you for mentioning not talking about the future. I'm too old to think that far ahead. So I mean, absolutely. Is it possible that you could have an overlay as because remember, we have the thing that most people don't necessarily viscerally understand is that we have essentially infinite processing power and infinite storage, and,
Right.
and an incredible like innovative like machine learning and unsupervised kind of algorithms like deep learning algorithms, things like this that can do really incredible things in real time, right? So and as you know, I'm a big believer in doing real time systems, right? This idea of let's batch processing in a month, we're going to give you a report. To me, that's not the consumerism world that we're in, whether we like it or not. So could you have an overlay that could in near real time provide you like this meter, this if you like fact meter or truth meter or whatever you want to call it? Absolutely. I mean, I think there's no doubt about that.
So this is just a comment, or I guess an idea someone had for you. If there's 90% truth, great, but maybe you can show where the 10% of not confirmed truth is coming from.
Absolutely. And that's why I'm saying that, Darshan, I think we should not, as technologists here, or really anyone involved in this, we should not be the judge and the jury.
Right.
We should be the analysts. We should be the guys who essentially provide you the picture in a usable way, but still tell you that the pros and cons, still tell you the good and the bad. We should not be the ones who adjudicate if this is real or not, because that's not our job. I think there are other people, historians, real journalists, other people we can possibly pontificate on that. I think our job should be to provide some kind of like metric that you can then use to make a better decision.
I'm going to get to that question later on, but I want to go, is that at some point ethically punting the question then? Where we're saying we're only part of one part of it, but we're not part of the journalism.
Now, right? That's all happening now. Look at influencers, quote influencers.
Yeah,
right?
Exactly.
That's happening now. All we're saying is that we're just providing another way, but really an objective, more of an objective meter, right? That's all. That's all we're saying. We're not saying, again, don't take my word for it, right? Because I think that's one of the big, again, we love blockchain. I love blockchain because the whole premise is don't take my word for it, right?
Okay.
Here's
Dan's last question. He's going to close us out for the question. Is there anything good with Polkadot building side chains from Ethereum and having a healthcare application?
So thank you, Dan. Honestly, I actually like Polkadot. It's a technology and protocol that we do like. Obviously, as you guys probably know, that their cryptocurrency is going through the roof and they're getting a lot of nice PR. It's not a technology that we are planning on building on. So I don't want to comment. Again, I know all about side chains. I think they have value. I'm more concerned about interoperability across side chains. And I think ultimately my thinking right now, at least the work we're doing, is using APIs off of a chain as opposed to side chains. That's the way I think about it architecturally. But all to say, from what I've seen with Polkadot, and by no means am I an expert, I think where they're going is a positive direction. I see them as being one of the few that will survive at this stage.
Awesome. So I'm going to recap where we are. So during this podcast, we talked a little bit about consensus building. We talked a little bit about viruses on software associated with DLTs. We talked a bit about trust scores. And then we really jumped into what is the news of the day, what is really viral right now, the idea of building trust and trusting news articles, if you will. Did I miss anything, Dan? Sorry, did I miss anything, Jim?
I don't know. We talked a lot, but
yeah, we did.
I think you got the main points.
Yeah.
But I really appreciate you doing this. I think, all kind of joking aside, it's good folk like you doing this stuff in a selfless way, even if it's one or two people who, like Dan, who asked this question, or Phil earlier or whatever, who are intrigued by this. And then, it's, again, and not to be a cliche, but so much of a blockchain is about collaboration. The whole idea of growing a blockchain as technology is about network effect. So if we kind of boil that down into the human form, and if the two of us then, create a little network effect with two more people and so on, I think these kind of conversations are needed, because I feel like a lot of people, with C titles at big companies, they're very, very comfortable doing what they're doing currently, especially in healthcare. Unfortunately, we know a number of these people individually, something's got to change, because they're not changing it. They're very too comfortable doing things exactly the same old way, and really they look at resistance as being the MO, and to me, that's just wrong.
So what I do want to point out.
You're cutting out, by the way.
Oh, sorry. What I do want to point out is this was a great podcast. Leave questions or comments for Jim, and we're gonna have Jim on again. And Jim, where can they find you?
Not after this performance.
Jim, how can people reach you if they want to come up with their next question for you?
I think the easiest thing is on Twitter for most folks. At Nasr is my handle, so I'm usually there, once or twice a day, and just check out things that are happening. So on LinkedIn as well, I'm fairly regular in that.
Awesome. And again, ladies and gentlemen, this was Jim Nasr, and we also have people saying thank you so much for this is very important for the future, whether or not we know it. David meets Goliath. So thanks again.
All right. Thank you so much.